V knihovně Václava Havla pro vás každý měsíc připravujeme až 20 akcí bez vstupného. Každý měsíc až 20 rozhovorů, debat a vzdělávacích videí na havelchannel.cz. Spolupracujeme s více než 1000 učitelů napříč republikou. Pořádáme workshopy, výstavy, vydáváme knihy. Náš archiv čítá přes 60 000 obrazových a psaných dokumentů. Každý rok udělujeme cenu Václava Havla za lidská práva bojovníkům za svobodu z celého světa. Pomozte nám i vy udržovat odkaz Václava Havla živý a přispějte na naši činnost na www.havelnavždy.cz. Děkujeme.
Dobrý večer, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Václav Havel Library. My name is Michael Zantovsky, and we have a very, very special evening ahead of us. Tomorrow, as you may remember, is the 17th of November, and it will mark 33 years since some events that shaped the next 33 years as of now. These were heady days, and I have some eyewitnesses to corroborate that when we start the discussion. But at the same time, they seem like ancient history now, because over the last few years we have suffered through a perfect storm of several seemingly unconnected crises, from the COVID pandemic through Putin's aggression against Ukraine and his pronouncements about the end of the liberal era, the energy crisis, the disruption of globalization chains and processes, the challenges of the democratisation of knowledge, and the advent of the postfactual era, as some people call it. And they can also be seen as different symptoms of a single crisis of responsibility that Václav Havel predicted in his memorable address to the joint meeting of the US Congress in 1990. But the good news is that these crises have also served as wake-up calls for liberal democrats and led to massive expressions of unity, solidarity, and courage and awareness of common purpose throughout of what used to be called the West. On the eve of the anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, two of its eyewitnesses and sympathetic observers, the historian Timothy Garton Ash, professor of European Studies at Oxford University, and journalist Misha Glenny, recently appointed rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, both of whom I'm proud to call my friends, and the political scientist Anna Durnova of the University of Vienna, who is a younger friend of ours, will share their thoughts on the Velvet heritage, on the crisis of liberal democracy, on the legacy of the Velvet Revolution, and Václav Havel. This event is taking place in cooperation between the Václav Havel Library and the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and the Institute of International Relations in Prague. We are also grateful to Marek Bican from the Ministry for European Affairs for his initiating role in bringing all of the partners together. And the debate will serve as a springboard for further dialogue. The debate takes place under the name of a Patočka debate that came to us from the Institute for Human Sciences. And the springboard for further dialogue is a joint project of the Institute for Human Sciences and the Institute of International Relations called the New Republic of Letters. So I will first ask the director of the Institute of International Relations, Ondřej Dittrich, to say a few words about the project.
Thank you very much. I'm not mic'd, so I will just try to speak loudly, and I really only want to use the podium to welcome you all here also on behalf of the Institute of International Relations and express my gratitude to our partners in crime in organizing this event. This format, the Patočka format, started in 2018, and it developed from lectures to debate. It may be sort of a counter-historical movement, I think, in a way. And I'm very grateful that on the eve of the 17th of November, we are here at Václav Havel Library, and we are doing this round of Patočka debate together with Václav Havel Library and with this great cast. This collaboration, I think, is a very nice example of the capacity to act together, to act in concert, to bring different institutions together to organize something meaningful, which by incident is Hannah Arendt's definition of power, and I happen to believe that it's something that powers liberal democracies, and it may be something that we are sort of in short supply these days. So I'm at least happy that we are here and we can open together temporarily this platform for the discussion of the future. And we will continue this, I hope, also in the format of the New Republic of Letters, which is another project of ours, and continue this intellectual exchange at a distance in the spirit of the Republic of Letters. So thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to what we are going to hear today. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Dietrich. And now let's start with the debate. It is often the case with us, all the people, to see developments with a somewhat jaundiced eye and predict that things will not end up well, which from a personal point of view makes a lot of sense. But it is also easy to lose sight of what has been accomplished and of the positive developments and of novel ideas that may carry the seeds of future progress. So my first question to all of you, and you choose the order in which you want to speak, against the background of what happened here 33 years ago, would be, is this a glass half empty or half full? Is liberal democracy seriously threatened, or will it be strengthened by the current crisis and flourish again? Or in medical parlance, what are the symptoms? What is the prognosis? And what remedies are there, if any? Floor is yours.
Okay. Why don't you start?
Okay, I can start. Good evening, everyone, and I'm happy to start as one of the younger generation, so to say, which usually does not appear on these kind of reflection formats, and this is also the reason why I'm happy that today we're going to not...
Could you speak up, Anna?
Maybe this is not on.
Yeah, maybe you need to turn it on.
Oh, I usually shout. Okay.
I'm not sure it's not turned on.
Hello?
I don't think it's on.
No, doesn't seem to be working.
No.
So maybe we'll give the floor to someone else,
Yes,
and
exactly.
repair your
And I'm gonna
mic
fix
in
the
the
sound.
meantime.
You start, go on. Pani rector.
No, I think it needs to be very, very near.
It's on.
And can I make some... you see?
Now we're here.
Now it works.
There you are.
Look.
Anna, you go first. You go first.
Okay, back to Anna.
So after this lovely performance in which you see that democracy is also about having a voice loud enough to be heard by the masses, I think I can start with saying that I'm very happy that we're going to talk about both the past and the future, because I think that's one of the main strength of public intellectuals and science and social science in particular, to be able to look back, but to be able also, while looking back, to look forward. So what are the symptoms? I mean, and I'm going to mingle between the Eastern European context and the Western European context a little bit. that we could say that if we look at the Western European part in 1960s and 1970s, we've been hearing, and many of us and many of you have been probably listening to these voices, we've been hearing a lot of autonomous voices, voices about giving rights to people, giving their right to shape their lives, to have a particular personal identity, sexual identity. And this has been flourishing as something which is one of the cores of liberal democracy. So we want to actually strengthen people's self-determination, their emancipation, and we want to look forward to seeing them flourish in a democratic system. So they have a voice, they can talk about it, they can shape their lives. In 1990s, in the Czech Republic and other CEE countries as well, we've been listening to those stories as something which is now coming. And we can finally shape our lives. There's no censorship, there's economic growth, and we're gonna get there. I would argue, to be a little bit cynical, that 33 years afterwards, we see world, and not only in the eastern part of Europe and central part of Europe, but in the western part of Europe as well, we see this world a little bit falling in two parts. One part is still shaping their lives as they want, in terms of their identity, and the other part is not. And this part is questioning highly the liberal democratic project. So why do we care about all these personal rights if we don't have material and economic resources to live this life? Mm-hmm. Why do we talk actually about things like gay rights, about identity politics, about culture, if we cannot afford it? So this brings me to the symptom, which I think that in this very important fight for freedom and autonomy, we have forgotten that freedom and autonomy needs also social and economic resources to flourish. And maybe this crisis, if you wish to talk at crisis, could serve us as a platform to think, can we, and if we can, how can we actually combine the right to self-determination and emancipation with a proper analysis of social and economic resources that need to be here in a democratic manner so that everyone can sort of, or most of us can profit from the project. I would have more points to say, but I leave it at there and to see what my fellow colleagues have to say, and we can develop it further.
Yeah. So, Misha.
So I'm trying to think of how to relate it back to what happened 33 years ago. And the thing that I remember now as we're talking about it, and when I stepped off the 22 tram onto Národní, was about that evening. Earlier in the evening, I have to go back to May the 1st of 1989 when I was covering the May Day parade in Wenceslas Square, and there were little groups all over Wenceslas Square who suddenly started chanting slogans for freedom and democracy and so on and so forth. And I was a BBC correspondent at the time, so I had my microphone. This was before digital technology, and so it was quite a weighty little thing. And I was recording a group of people saying freedom, democracy, and so on and so forth. And suddenly I found myself lifted up by an octopus of about 8 people, and I was taken off to a side street just below the Yalta Hotel, a tiny little passage there, and it was about 6 or 7 members of the STB, and they grabbed hold of my recording equipment. One of them hit me in the jaw, and they threw the recording equipment down onto the ground and accused me of all manner of things, and then I was frog marched off to Školská ulice around the corner and put in a prison with about 200 other people, including Stanislav Devátý, which was the first time I met him as it happened. And this was all quite traumatic. It was a minor little incident with the British government and so on and so forth. And then, and I'll never forget the guy who was the main guy from the SDB who was arranging this. And then on the 17th of November, about an hour and a half before the whole thing flew up, I was there where Tesco's and on the corner of Národní and whatever it is, going the other way. And there were a group of students already becoming agitated and shouting slogans and everyone getting really excited. And in the middle of this, shouting the slogans and getting everyone excited, was the SDB agent who had hit me on May the 1st and was clearly, you know, getting everyone to demonstrate. And I tried to go up to him and see him, but he then ran off. And as he ran off, he had this huge smile on his face. And for me, it summed up the ambiguity of what was going on, of how we couldn't actually know what the political processes underneath the Velvet Revolution were. And it's a phenomenon I experienced, and later on there was much research about to what extent the STB was preparing itself for the post-revolutionary situation, which might explain his participation. And that ambiguity of the revolution was something that stuck with me for a variety of reasons, partly because in a more extreme sense, the same thing happened in the year 2000 in Serbia when Milosevic was brought down. And Milosevic was brought down essentially because the security services and the oligarchs who had supported him decided that he was no longer of use to them, and so he was dispensable. But it also came back to me since 2016, and since you've seen the polarization of society that Anna was speaking about, and who is and why are people promoting the polarization of society, and what are the forces underneath what we see on the surface driving this, and are they forces that we can identify? And I was struck by the fact that from 2016 onwards, I was in Brazil during the Brexit referendum in São Paulo, and I stayed up all night watching the Brexit referendum, fearing that what happened would happen and did happen. And the next day I had lunch with a group of very sophisticated São Paulo intellectuals. And I was full of the fact that the United Kingdom had left the European Union and that this was a disaster. And for people in Brazil, even rather sophisticated people like this lot, they simply didn't understand what I was talking about and why this was such an important event. And then 2 years later, of course, Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil. Trump had already been elected president of the United States. And suddenly what I realized, what was going on was this polarization where exactly the same processes were happening in whichever country you went to, but they were refracted through a very specific local cultural prism, so that it was extremely difficult for people to understand exactly what was going on. So the question, I come back to that thing about what are the forces underneath? Why is this happening everywhere around the world, but people don't recognize it as a pattern because of the fact that they are engaged in their own specific local culture? And it has taken us a long time to recognize the commonality of these processes going on around the world. And I'll stop there for the moment, but just to say that I think that that's something that is worth exploring, is what are the deeper causes that are leading to the polarization which we now experience on an everyday level in our lives.
Fair point. Tim, would you?
Listen, first of all, it's fantastic to be here.
on this anniversary in this crowded room. If it was smoke-filled, it would remind me of the Latana Magica, but it's not. And to celebrate, where better to celebrate than at the Václav Havel Library with so many old friends. And actually, I think it looks, the Velvet Revolution, capital V, capital R, looks particularly good against the backdrop of the perfect storm you were talking about, with the largest war in Europe since 1945, with nationalist populists in so many countries, with the consequences of COVID, with refugee crisis here and there, with Brexit, and so it goes on. And it looks good because we can see now what an exceptional moment it was. At the time, we thought an almost miraculous moment. And we understood that at the time, just how extraordinary and exceptional and almost miraculous it was. An example of what Machiavelli calls fortuna, historical luck. And one reason we're in this mess 33 years later is that at some point in the early 2000s, we started to forget that. We started to forget that, and we started to believe that this was the way history was going, right? That what happened between 1989 and 1991 was the new normal, and that democracy and prosperity and peace would spread as part of an almost natural process. In other words, we took history with a small h, the product of conjuncture, chance, individual action, struggle, and turned it into history with a capital H, a Hegelian process of the inevitable progress towards freedom, right? So we turned what is actually a struggle, always the struggle for freedom, and turned it into a process, and we yielded to overconfidence, complacency, and hubris. And just when we'd reached our most hubristic, our most triumphant, which, by the way, was not the Fukuyama moment. This is a great mistake. It wasn't the end of history. It wasn't 1990. You will remember, Michael, Misha will remember, many in this room. In 1990, we had no idea whether the transition to democracy would succeed. We had no idea whether you could turn the fish soup back into an aquarium. We had no idea whether you could enlarge the European Union and NATO. We had no idea whether you could make a single European currency. We had no idea whether you could make a freedom of movement area called the Schengen zone. All these things came after 1990, but it's more the early mid-2000s that the hubris sets in. And of course, it's precisely at the moment of hubris that the problems start, 2007, 2008. I would say the big turning point is 2008, the beginning of the global financial crisis, and Georgia, the annexation of South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and then it goes on. Eurozone crisis, Viktor Orban coming to power in Hungary 2010, Ukraine, Crimea 2014, refugee crisis, Brexit, Trump, COVID, populism in Poland, need I go on all the way to the 24th of February this year. Now, in terms of the analysis, I mean, there's so much to be said about it, but since you put the question to liberal democracy, let me make just a few points about the content of our hubris. First of all, I think we ended up reducing liberalism, particularly in post-communist Europe, essentially just to economic liberalism. And liberalism that is only economic is not liberalism at all. A liberalism that doesn't have the social and the political and cultural dimensions is not liberalism. Secondly, we linked our liberalism much too closely to one particular model of capitalism, globalized, financialized capitalism. Call it neoliberalism if you will, we can argue about whether that's the right label. And that it was through this hypertrophied financial sector, which both gave us levels of inequality not seen in Europe for 100 years, and led us directly into the global financial crisis, which segued into the Eurozone crisis and the Great Recession. So I think that was the second big mistake. And off the back of saying, in a kind of vulgar Marxism, when we look back, it's the economy, stupid, we neglected these other dimensions. So this goes precisely to Anna's point. It's not just that half our societies were not doing well out of globalization and out of this model of capitalism. So we made the economist mistake. Are there economists in the room? You must forgive me what I say now. So economists tend to think that aggregate gains will compensate for local human losses. In aggregate, globalization lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Yes, but those people were in India and China. They weren't in the post-industrial north of England or the Rust Belt of the United States or southeastern Poland. For the people who were living in those parts of our societies, it didn't compensate at all. And on top of the economic inequality, you had what I call the inequality of attention and respect. So when you look at all the different populisms, to go to Misha's point, one thing they have in common, it's never just about the economy. It's always both about the economy and about culture. You could almost say it's a culture, stupid. And so that was another thing we neglected. And in all our societies, in different ways, you have this phenomenon of people in small towns or the countryside or without university education looking at people like us in the Václav Havel library and saying those liberal metropolitan elites don't understand us and don't care about us. So I think those are really important elements, Michael, in the diagnosis. But the great strength of liberalism is its capacity for self-criticism. Unfortunately, everything I've just said, you've all heard before, because various authors have said it over the last 10, 15 years. And I think liberals are beginning to learn from our mistakes, our big mistakes, that self-criticism is happening. And if I may say so, one area where I see this happening is precisely Central Europe. When I came here in 2019 for the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, I was very worried indeed. Viktor Orban, peace, Babiš, Slovakia not looking good. It looked as if the trend was going very strongly in this region towards nationalist populism. Come back now in 2022, one has a real sense of a movement in the opposite direction. You told me you had Zuzana Čaputová here this afternoon. There's a great example, a liberal, pro-European, relatively young human rights lawyer as president of Slovakia. The change of government in this country I read as an encouraging sign. The erosion of the position of peace in Poland. Hungary, alas, not looking so good. So that I think it's not a glass half full or half empty. It's a stream of history. But I think the stream is beginning to turn our way again.
Can I just add one what I would think is slight corrective about what you're saying, Tim, about the hubris of the early 2000s. I think the problem lies in the 1990s, which I refer to as the decade of delusion, when we all thought it was going fantastically well because we were accumulating wealth based on assets which didn't have that value. This was, I think, the response to 1989 was, we won the Cold War, and so we can now fashion the world in according to our vision. And 2007, 2008, and particularly 2008, was the culmination of that almost orgiastic indulgence in financial capitalism around the world. But the signs were there in the 1990s with the Asian crash, with the collapse of the ruble in Russia, and indeed Putin's rise to power itself. And so, while I agree with you that absolutely that was when it starts manifesting itself, and that's when we should all be saying, this is really, really serious. in order to try and avoid 2016. It's actually our behavior in the 1990s which caused this.
Yeah, but I think it's carrying on with the behavior when we should have been correcting. So, for example, New Labour being extremely close to the City of London, to financial services, and Peter Mandelson famously saying he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. But also, Misha, and I was thinking of this in the European context, and in the European context, the reason I focus on the early to mid-2000s is then you have the euro launched and seeming to be going well. Then you have Schengen up and functioning. Then you have the big enlargement, eastward enlargement of the EU and of NATO. So all these things have come into place. And by the way, you have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which confirmed us in the view that this was the way history was going, and democracy was going to spread next to, and Europe to Ukraine. So I think that was the moment of maximum delusion, if you like.
Well, before you run away with the debate on New Labour and Peter Mandelson, let's
Does anyone know who Peter
go
Mandelson
back
is?
to the to the large picture. You know, the problem in part, I think, is that history only makes sense in retrospect. You know, as it is happening, it consists of events which are contradictory, absurd, which is more of a rule than an exception in these parts, and don't make much sense at all. I mean, Misha told this wonderful anecdote about this STB guy in the middle of the crowd of revolutionary students at Národní třída, and I was a witness to many such events, which then gave rise to all kinds of conspiracy theories about the Velvet Revolution. And I myself was the Reuters correspondent in Prague at that time, was hauled in front of the committee to investigate the events of the 17th of November 1989. It was a parliamentary committee, and they had a file full of Reuters reports, etc., etc. And they were after something, I could tell. And they asked all kinds of seemingly innocuous questions, and then they got to the point and said, well, you know, you, Reuters, reported the death of the student Schmidt on the evening of November 17th, and you say you got the report from two independent sources, but we know that they only came with the story at about 21 o'clock. And you filed the report at 20:30. How can you explain that, Mr. Zantovsky? And I said, well, you know, if you look at the small print in the report, it says GMT. It's and you know, lots of such stories occur. You know, we may have fared a little better than some of the rest on the end of history, because we, in this country, we are largely inoculated against the Hegelian idea of the irreversible course of march of history to progress. We've all grown up on a diet of progress. You know, the best progressive idea in the history of mankind, with an absolutely certain end and goal, and we knew it was rubbish, you know. And you know, Václav Havel said as much in his address to the Congress. The history is made by people. It's not a matter of impersonal forces, etc., etc. But you, all three of you, identified some of the suspects in this search for the symptoms and the remedies. One is hubris, that Václav Havel spoke about time and again, and it was his, favorite culprit in this. But then also not capitalism, but the form of capitalism that was applied and linked to that globalization. Globalization is something that when it started, it was largely advertised as something that brings the world together. And in some ways it was, but at the same time it was making splits within societies that participate in the overall process, because it divided the societies into people who had a breakfast in Singapore and they lunch in London and they dinner in New York and worried about Ebola and global warming, and the people who did not globalize, they stayed localized and worried about the bus to take to work and the school for their children, etc., etc. And we have not really heeded the warnings. And the fact that this division, this split, took place in such diverse places as Brazil, United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, etc., speaks about the presence of universal causes or global causes for this. And I think globalization was one, and the last that you mentioned was culture, again, linked to the globalization, and again there was this mistaken or arrogant idea actually that in following the process of globalization we are creating a global culture, and what we really created was a very superficial semblance of culture at the level of pop music and stupid TV series, etc., etc. But the culture, the real culture, did not become globalized. It stayed localized. So here we are, and I can only applaud your ability of a liberal intellectual for self-criticism. And but where do we go from here?
Maybe I can add something to this nice complex narrative of global versus local. And I'm going to start by saying that at some point we haven't learned from history, or we haven't looked really well at the epistemological lesson we have from the Velvet Revolution, so to say. Because your story with the guy is also a story about ambivalency of social movements and social changes. And we have seen that also with disinformation campaign, with Brexit, and there are a couple of social scientists who are trying to figure out why people actually change. Why do we have so many people that have been voting Socialist Party in French and then actually moved to Le Pen? So what is it about these people that they have to actually change their mind? Who made them change their mind? Is it some global history movement that made it? Is it some sort of disinformation campaign? So who did it? And I like your point about the economist, and I think we could even take it further, that if we take the economic epistemology, we see an aggregation of individual behaviors. And against that, we have a bunch of work in social sciences that says, well, wait a minute, it's probably a little bit more complex than that. It's not only about individual behaviors and aggregation of them, but it's also the social political context, the culture from which we live. And when we talk about culture, it's not only about the area that we like to spend in our free time, but it's also the moral resources, the economic resources that we mobilize to argue for things. Does family include gay rights? Are females going to vote? This is also part of cultural battles, and no wonder we have culture wars. So the lesson that I think we haven't learned that much, and especially in Czech context, is that things are not black and white. And this might sound very banal for me, and also from someone who's from younger generation. But I really like your story about saying, well, the financial crisis was one of the peaks that made also visible the negative causes of global capitalism, and that made also very visible the negative causes of global capital. What does it do to things like climate change, for example, right now? But if you take a look back at the last decade of the Czech media discourse, you wouldn't find those argumentations and discussions that you find in New York Times or Guardian. You wouldn't find them, because fighting the economic liberalism is still 33 years after the Revolution of Sin. You can't do this. It's a black and white, you can't argue for, I mean, just yesterday we have been hearing some of the big media discussions about students protesting against the climate change. And one of the, many of the opinion leaders were actually criticizing them for saying that the earth is burned by capitalism. Well, you may argue about the rhetoric, you may argue whether you would like to get that protest, but arguing that global capital and that form of capitalism has to do with climate change is nothing really revolutionary outside of the CE countries. Yet here, it caused a huge storm. Why? Because we have still this historic, I don't know how you call it, like historic decor of not arguing about capitalism, as if we would actually lose what was so good about the 1990s. And I think that 33 years are time for saying, well, we've grown up, we've been 33 years old, we can say that, of course, and you said that actually, there were very good things about that. Finally, people could do actually their own businesses. These are flourishing, that's good. But maybe there are also downsides, and it's worth to discuss them. And maybe discussing those downsides of global capitalism does not mean returning back. There's not a black and white story. There are ambivalences. And maybe if we accept those ambivalences, people would listen to us. Because what is it to praise the possibility of being able to travel because of the 1989? What is it for people here in the Czech Republic if they can't afford it? That's not really something they can carry on. So if this is the only narrative, and it's the largely most represented narrative in the media discourse of the Czech media, if that's the narrative of 1989, then we have a problem. And then it's time for self-criticism, as you said, and say, well, what else is there for liberalism? And how can we combine the economic story of liberalism with the culture one so that it makes sense for more people? And one particular thing that I found so nice about what you said about the Brazil and Great Britain and USA and also Orban. So we've seen localized movement, but being argued with highly global narratives. And I think this is something we need to learn from. There are a lot of studies that try to actually figure out whether this rural-urban divide is a real one, so to say, to cut the long story short, or whether it is also a sort of discursive pattern of how we actually look at those stories. And that many of us, and we hear that, are actually importing concepts or importing narratives, although they are not relevant to us. You know, the differences between the US rural area and urban area are highly visible, but they are not so in Austria. Yet, if you would look at the presidential campaign in 2016 in Austria and the US, you would find the same narratives, because that's the cultural representation, that's the story we tell. And maybe if we go to these causes, like why do people believe narratives that are actually not reflected in their own economic structures, why they're actually adopting some different concepts that are not relevant to their everyday lives. Maybe that could be one part of saying, okay, what is it there? Why do people combine these things that do not really match together, and they are successful, politically successful with that?
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
I mean, a situation in which you're not allowed to criticize liberalism is deeply illiberal. It's a contradiction in terms, a liberalism that doesn't allow itself to be criticized, because criticism is all about critical debate. Sort of to pick up on what you just said, Anna, let me tell you a story from a faraway country called Britain. Where in the course of our encounter with populism, namely the Brexit debate, a colleague of mine, a political scientist called Alan Menon, was trying to explain in a town in northern England, a rather poor, relatively poor town, about the likely consequences of Brexit for GDP. And he said, you know, it's going to reduce our GDP. And an angry woman got up at the back, as in Newcastle, and said, Professor Menon, that's your GDP. That's not my GDP. And it was making a profound point, which is, one, about the global aggregates of economists, but two, this whole language, this rational, scientific, cold discourse, so characteristic of liberals when you spend all your time talking about things like GDP. That's not my language, that's not my life. And I think that illustrates a broader problem without wanting to simplify into two black and white dichotomies. You know, one of the liberal dreams was to have more education. That's something liberals really believe in. And so we said we want to put more people into higher education. Let's have 50% of our society in higher education. And the unintended consequence was that we've divided our societies slap bang down the middle, 50-50, between those who went to university, speak languages, live often in big cities, travel, love Europe with its freedom of movement because they've also got enough money to enjoy it and they have the languages to move around in Europe, like globalization, and love liberalism, and those who didn't go to higher education, maybe live in small towns, post-industrial towns in the countryside, don't speak that same language and feel themselves ignored and neglected. So that I think that is something that we really have to address. And then the populists come along and not only actually address their socio-economic concerns, because let me tell you, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, one of the key reasons it's been so successful is this move called 500+, which is 500 zlotys for each child in each family each month. I've talked to families, poor families in Poland, for whom this made a huge difference. And they say to me, it's not just about the money, it also gave us dignity. It gave us our dignity. The combination of that social policy, which is what we should have been doing as liberals, with a simplistic, mendacious, but emotionally appealing nationalist narrative. That combination has been very effective. And we as liberals have to find the answer to it. And the answer is partly what you're talking about, actual socio-economic policies. But it's also in finding a new narrative that isn't just all about GDP and appealing to people like us and to intellectual arguments, but is actually emotionally appealing.
Yes, and Orban did the same with the mortgage scandal in Hungary. He addressed that issue where many Hungarians, I mean tens of thousands of Hungarians, found themselves after 2008 saddled with these euro and Swiss franc mortgages, with the forint having collapsed, and Orban addressed that issue in a way that nobody else had done. I'm wondering, let me introduce something else into this debate, and that is the issue of technology. Not so much, although it plays to it, about the way that populists have used technology and used the democratizing promise of technology for their own purposes, but just the issue of the speed of social change as a consequence of technology. Humankind has never experienced social reality change at the speed that it has done in the past 15 or so years, such that it is now extremely hard, if you're a parent, to understand the socialization processes that your children are going through in a way that I would argue has never happened before. We have seen all manner of social consequences of this. The whole issue of anxiety and the extraordinary increase in mental health issues, particularly amongst young people, the idea that we're supposed to be more in control of our lives and yet feeling ever less in control of our lives. The whole issue of the information tsunami that all of us feel on a daily basis. I have to try and understand what's going on in Indonesia. I need to know what's happening to the Amazon. I need to process all this information and try and actually make sense of it, both for myself personally and for my community. We're in a social and cultural space that we've never been in before. And so enormous are the processes that are going on economically, culturally, socially, politically. Even in warfare, we have the possibility of new weapons, of a new type of non-kinetic warfare, i.e. cyber warfare, coming into play, that it is really difficult for us individually and collectively to comprehend what is going on. And this speaks to the thing which Adam Tooze has recently made popular, which is the polycrisis situation, is that we are simply trying to manage in our own heads too much, that it renders the possibility of collective action more difficult.
Well, I'm not sure. It's, you know, I will fall back on my original profession. And, you know, from a psychological point of view, the technological advances themselves, you know, are the speed of it, perhaps. But this has been the case for the last 2 centuries and at least 3 centuries, and at some moments you could argue that the pace of change was even higher. It's okay. Let me finish, Misha. It's that these information technologies that we're using are making people isolated. More than ever before, and that's, you know, for a psychologist, anxiety is, you know, the first thing you will be looking for is isolation, social exclusion, etc., etc. And this has been, you know, made very, very clear during the COVID 2 years. You know, when our kids, we may have kids almost of the same age, you know, were suddenly locked at homes, at dormitories, you know, without the opportunity to communicate, and the only way they could communicate was through these gadgets that they are multiplying by the day, and they are anxious. I don't know about England, but here in this country, the rate of anxieties over the last 3 years has skyrocketed. You know, it's a growing industry. So, okay, we have a new suspect, that's technology. But I would like to return for a moment to what Anna said, because I think it has been a bit of an exaggeration. You know, I think that in this country we do have a lively discourse about capitalism and its flaws and its problems. Maybe some of the politicians don't. And at the moment we're having a center-right government, so it's only natural that they are less perceptive of this. But deep down, the question for me, for you, and for all of you, is okay. But for a long time we have believed that there is a close link between capitalism and liberal freedoms. You know, from Locke and Smith and others, we were led or brought up or learned to believe that without a free market, a free exchange of ideas, a free way to pursue your happiness and your success, freedom is impossible. So isn't liberalism without capitalism a contradiction in terms? Or can we envisage a different kind of liberalism that would not be tainted by capitalism? I don't know.
Well, maybe we can start. It's a lovely question, and I'm happy about your optimistic view of the public discussion, and we can maybe do that later. But I would like to say something different on that, because it also brings me back to what you have, both of you have said, and it might be, maybe there is also one suspect which is sort of on a meta level within all these stories, and that's this fundamental relationship between individual or subject, citizen, and the public institution, which liberalism partly has not solved or made problematic. As you've said, we are actually taught and taught on several terms, not only in schools, but also by the public discourse, that as liberal individuals we can shape our lives, and we should also take a look that we're authentic, that we live our lives with our own control and not with control of the others, which partly excludes since institutions, especially a patronizing behavior from institutions. We should emancipate ourselves. And I don't know how many of you have kids and watch fairy tales with them. But if you look at the fascinating cultural move in the narratives of the fairy tales, you would see that we don't have heroes anymore that would fight. We don't have heroes anymore where princesses would marry prince. We have heroes that actually fight with themselves. They fight their own anxiety. They find their own fears. Why? Because that's the cultural pattern in which our kids grow up. They can choose their identity. They should choose their lifestyle. It's not about why you have these shoes, but why have you chosen these shoes, and why are they part of your identity? And as you said, the technology actually makes that even more possible. You have like Be Real, for example, the newest technology where you have the back camera and the front camera, and you just capture one picture every day of your real life, which needs to be authentic. You need to say something to people. And this is, as Ulrich Beck, among others, said, and many other feminist theories have also largely pointed to, this is problematic because in a long term, it brings all your faults and faults also to be your own. To be, in very cynical terms, before we could argue that it's our social class, that it's politics, or that's religion, it's God, but now it's us. Everything is on us, and that's a high burden. You need not only academic resources to do something about that, but also culture ones. And if we speak about things like anxiety, which, by the way, is a high issue everywhere in Europe, and I actually just right now run a project on social isolation as a collateral damage of the pandemic society. And what we see is exactly a rise of anxiety, which is largely connected to the way public institutions have been dealing with the problem. And the way public institutions, or the narratives that public institutions deal with the problem, are that it's happening on the individual level. You should do something about that. You should have the strength to do something about that, which brings us in a way in a deadlock dynamic, because I need to be authentic, I need to be strong, and yet I need help from someone. So how do I actually get away from that? So I like your story about the digitalization, because I think it turns us also to one of these fundamental relationships that is not solved yet, which is how does liberal democracy envision an individual and the institution when it says, or when we are supposed to be emancipated and autonomous, and yet from time to time need help or need a supervision by a public institution to get along with our lives.
If I could come in on that. One of my favorite book titles is a title of a book about how teenagers use social media. And the title of this book is It's Complicated. I really like that title, because it's complicated, and one really has to beware of simple generalizations, particularly from older people, about how younger people use social media or the internet. Because, you know, on the one hand it atomizes, but on the other hand it connects. You can create your virtual communities. So I think it's, you know, I think one has to look at it in a much more granular fashion, and also actually for the fate of liberal democracy, the media landscape in a given country, the total information environment, is as important as just the fact of social media. So there have been very good studies made by scholars in media studies, Berkman Center at Harvard, for example, which shows that Fox News is more important than Facebook for the hyperpolarization of the United States. But actually what is most powerful is the combination of Fox News and talk radio and Facebook. Yeah. Or similarly, Orban, it's not just Facebook, it's not just state television, it's not just the government billboards, it's when you have government billboards and state television and Facebook all pushing the same message in different ways. To this point of individualism, individualism is an indispensable component of liberalism. There's no question about that. But it is a parody of liberalism to pretend that liberalism only believes in individualism, in us as atomized individuals. Liberals have always understood that we're embedded in society, in communities, and that we have affective, emotional relationships with institutions. That's one of the great things about liberal democracy. A successful liberal democracy, people identify with Parliament. I mean, for me, the symbol of Britain is not Buckingham Palace. It's the Houses of Parliament. We identify very strongly with that institution. Americans identify with their courts. They emotionally, they act to defend their courts. And I think one of the things that went wrong was that we neglected this question of the individual embedded in communities, notably the national community. For a long time, liberals talked about the other half of the world, but not about the other half of our society. We talked a lot about the international community and Europe, but far too little about the national community. We left talking about the nation to the right. And so one of the things we have to do is actually to start talking about the nation again, but in a liberal civic sense, and not an ethno-nationalist sense.
All right. Okay. This is...
we've given you all the answers.
No, we've suggested some of the answers, or hinted at some of the answers, but we are in the Václav Havel Library, and Václav Havel was a man, as you know, and as we all know, that who believed in dialogue, who was a playwright. And so that's one of the reasons we don't have lectures in this library. We have discussions, debates, and we always invite our audiences to participate in the debate. So now the floor is open for your contributions, and I see one, and I see 2, 3, 4. We may not have time for more, but we will try. It depends on you. Okay.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I'm a PhD candidate studying the development of counter-disinformation policies and their implication for democracies. So this was very interesting to me. And I want to jump back to what you were saying in your first word, saying what's the underlying cause? Who's the culprit, right? And I think it's very obvious that the information technology revolution is part of the blame. The foreign agents that are taking advantage of it are part of the blame, but they're just amplifiers. They're just amplifying something that already exists. They're taking advantage of an already existing division, an already existing disagreement within society, right? And so I think who's the culprit? It's ourselves. And I think it's so important to have that self-reflection that you were talking about. And personally, I see a lot of that self-reflection having to do with financial capitalism that you mentioned. And so if we want to move forward with that and give away that obsession with growth being GDP growth and financial growth. What's the alternative to that financial growth? How can we reinvent growth in terms of, I don't know, sustainable development? What would be your package of the new growth?
Can I just I think you raise a very, very important point about one thing, and that is that these divisions existed in our society, and I think the Democrats in the United States made a big error putting so much energy into trying to identify Vladimir Putin as being the person behind Donald Trump, as opposed to looking at what was going on in American society that enabled Donald Trump to become president of the United States. Because it wasn't the Russians that invented Trump, it was the breakdown of American institutions, in my opinion, that allowed him to assume the position he did. Or not necessarily the breakdown in the institutions, but there was something profoundly distressed about American society that allowed someone like Donald Trump to become president.
Yeah, and I have one doubt that when I express it now, some of my economist friends will crucify me for. But, in the end, what's so great about growth? It's, haven't we been doing well enough until now? Do we need to be better off? And Václav Havel was my inspiration for this in his speech to the Italian Senate in 2004. He targeted this obsession, as he put it, with continuous expansion and growth of growth as a typically European idea, which should be questioned as well.
Yeah, but can I disagree with you there, Michael, my friend?
You will be disagreeing with Václav Havel.
I will even dare to disagree with the ghost of Václav Havel and the Václav Havel Library. Although actually, I have to say, as Michael knows, in a new book, I have a chapter about Havel, and one of the striking things is how prescient he was in anticipating this debate about environmental sustainability. But if I were a poor African sitting at the back of this room and saw these well-fed, comfortably off Europeans sitting in a well-heated room before going off to a nice dinner and saying, what's so great about growth, right? Why do we need more growth? Well, we don't need more growth because we've had it since the Industrial Revolution. And we have to have an answer to the billions of people in the world who haven't had these growth, who resent the fact that all the growth has been, enjoyed by the West, or if you like, the North. What are we going to offer them? So we can do our own, energy transitions and make our countries carbon neutral. But the really big question is, what about the other 6 billion people?
Okay, just to make a small exception to this. I think the data shows that there has been continuous growth globally over the last 50 years. It's just that other countries started from different levels, and the pace of growth was different. But it's not. I don't think it's factually right to say that only we had the growth and others did not.
No, but they have much further to go.
Yeah,
right?
I acknowledge that.
They're not sitting in a comfortable room in Prague.
It'd be stupid not to.
But maybe I'll just add to that, and you actually took away my answer to the question, which is I think that the new narrative that we need to push forward instead of the narrative of growth is the narrative of redistribution. And to speak about, and since you said that effective relationships to public institutions and to culture narrative is important to liberal democracy, then we need to actually really fabricate very carefully this new narrative of redistribution as something which makes us humans, which makes us liberals, which makes us Democrats. And no wonder that this is one of the biggest struggles, argumentation struggles and political struggles within the climate change debate. Because that's, you can't discuss climate change without discussing the redistribution issue. You can't discuss climate change without discussing the taxing the rich movement, etc. You can't discuss the climate change without discussing the global capitalism. So, and I think all these little parts are part of the new culture narrative of...
Can I just add one more thing as well on the climate change? You can't discuss the green transition without engaging where you're going to get all the critical raw materials that are required for the green transition. We're going to have to rip up the earth in the way that we've never done it before if we are going to achieve our green targets in order to get all of the rare earth metals and critical raw materials. Most of those metals tend to be situated in places like the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo or Brazil or Indonesia. And the unfortunate thing about the green transition is it is going to mean another scramble for resources in which, sadly, the Global South are going to be the major contributors to those resources, and it's going to result in extreme disruption to their social economic circumstances. So this is something that, if liberalism has a number of challenges, one of them is precisely what you say, Anna, about how we are going to redistribute the benefits of those resources that we are going to have to find if we want to prevent climate change actually leading to sort of planetary catastrophe.
And the official definition of the green transition as a growth-based strategy, which was, you know, the best selling point for it when it came about. But whether it's not contradictory is another problem. Okay, this part of the room, this side of the room, the gentleman in the black sweater. I'm sorry. You know, there was one question from here, there will be my question, and then we go back.
It's a dialogue, isn't it? Jonathan Dronsfield from the Institute of Philosophy here in Prague. It's not liberalism that is self-critical. It's democracy that is self-critical. It's an instance of hubris for liberals to aggregate to themselves self-criticality. And there are plenty of people who in 1989 were calling for freedom, who today would deny gender equality and sexual equality. People's minds can be changed, and once you grasp that it's democracy that is self-critical, it leads to a responsibility, and that is a constant vigilance and a need to attend to persuading other people's minds through reasoned discussions such as this, but not to assume that that is just the preserve of liberals. So I think that democracy and the task of us liberals to defend democracy entails that we just continually attend to trying to persuade and not necessarily complain about those who we might want to call illiberal. Illiberals can change their minds as well as liberals.
I think that's an invitation to liberal self-criticism, isn't it? Yes. Look, I was not making it as an exclusive claim that only liberals are given to self-criticism. But if you want to go broader than that, I wonder if the right category is democracy. I think, you know, the argument one would want to make is probably the legacy of the Enlightenment. That's to say, it's something about the Western intellectual tradition that has this quality of self-criticism, I would argue anyway.
Yeah, and you know, it's an aspect of liberalism is that it's supposed, not always is, but it's supposed to be tolerant. You know, illiberals, I'm afraid, you know, are not always so tolerant to begin with. So it makes changing their minds, discussing with them, it makes it harder. It's, you know, that's what makes them illiberal. Please. Yes.
Well, thank
Martin,
you for this excellent discussion.
Question to Professor Garton Ash. The dangers of retrospective determinism, fascinating topic. The history with capital H or small h also. So if we take 1989 as a ground moment,
And then we used this framework until the Russian aggression in February 2022 as another moment of acceleration of history, to borrow the phrase of Reinhard Koselleck. And then we go again with this fortuna. Can we see the war in Ukraine as a new moment of the reinvigoration of European project? Or if not, what would that be?
Okay. I think it's a terrific question, Jan, and I'm so glad you asked it, because it enables us to talk about Europe, because I was hoping we'd talk a bit more about Europe this evening, which was actually, after all, one of the great themes of the Velvet Revolution of 1989. And my answer to your question is emphatically yes, that every crisis contains an opportunity. This is a very big crisis and contains a very big opportunity. I've just finished writing a history of contemporary Europe, and looking back, you can see that there's a great forward and upward movement of European history, which goes roughly from the mid-1980s, obviously then gaining enormous dynamism in 1989, until the early to mid-2000s. If you think about EU enlargement, for example, this huge forward movement until roughly 2007. And after that, there's been tiny, tiny progress. And if you're North Macedonia and you've been a candidate for, 20 years and you're getting nowhere, you've ceased to believe in Europe's promises, in the dynamism of the European project. Now, the opportunity that this crisis presents is to recover that dynamism and to have a really major new phrase in, if you like, to use a phrase from 1989, the extension of Europe whole and free. If we're serious now about enlargement to the Western Balkans, but also, as the EU has said, to Ukraine, to Georgia and Moldova, and to doing all the other things that would be necessary to make that possible and to make the European Union continue to work when you had 36 member states, that for me is a really big and exciting strategic project for the European Union. So yes, I do. I see this as a moment of great opportunity.
First, we will have to win the war.
That is also
Martin.
I would like to bring back discussion to the revolution itself. You try to evoke the atmosphere, some sort of something is in the air, public expectations.
But you're right.
But you have not mentioned anything like what the other side was doing. The role of General Jaruzelski in that situation, the role of Prime Minister Adamec in his famous handshake with Václav Havel, and then his appearance on the Wenceslav Square, on this demonstration in Letna. But also in the reflexive process, the first book that tried to lay out some interpretation of Dahrendorf's reflections on the revolution in Europe, inspired by Edmund Burke, who did that 200 years before in his reflections on French Revolution. And this was written for General Jaruzelski to answer his question. So I'm just telling you that this is something to think about, to understand ourselves better even today. And now my question to Tim. During these revolutionaries, we are spending a lot of time together and discussing about things around ourselves that we're taking in very high speed, very hardly to understand. We are surprised all the time. And then when Tim tried to reflect on it, he most likely was inspired by Dahrendorf also, and quoted François Furet, French historian, with all this fuss and noise, not a single new idea has come out of this revolution. It is a time for all well-tested ideas now. Tim, do you think it's really right? Because I think that we are now in badly need of new ideas. And final thing, can ideas be new? I think philosophers would have a problem with concepts of new ideas. You mentioned Patočka here, but Patočka is somewhat absent in this discussion. And my final thing, please read the Husserl's Crisis of European Civilization, Patočka's interpretation of it, and struggle between two concepts. Modern technology, or modern science and technology on one side, and this old-fashioned concept, the care for the soul. It might be something to look at again in our current context.
So this question from Martin Paluš makes me truly nostalgic, because this is an argument Martin and I have been having for 33 years. So it's, whatever else, it's not a new argument. And I would absolutely insist, because so many participants in these events and analysts of these events said exactly the same thing. What was the key phrase of 1989, right across East Central Europe? It was, we want to be a normal country. And what did people mean by being a normal country? They meant something like West Germany or France or Britain, or perhaps how they imagined West Germany, France or Britain to be. So it was a very unusual kind of revolution in which the object of the revolution was to attain an existing normality next door, what Habermas called die nachholende Revolution. Adam Michnik said the motto is not liberté, égalité, fraternité, it's liberté, fraternité, normalité. So I think that analysis was correct, with one qualification, Martin, which I have made in the subsequent 33 years, which is that I think the new idea was the revolution itself. That is to say, the way in which you make a fundamental revolutionary transformation of a whole system by peaceful means and by negotiation. So for me, the new idea was the idea of doing Velvet Revolution itself. And this is where, for example, quick example, I went to visit Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar in 2000-2001, because she was really interested in the work of Václav Havel and other East Central Europeans. She really wanted to learn from them. And I came away very concerned, because she was magnificently courageous and moral, but she didn't have that shrewd political instinct that Václav Havel had, because Václav Havel had a shrewd political instinct, and she didn't understand that when the moment comes, you have to seize the moment and find the partners in the existing system who are prepared to do business with you. So that she actually had the opportunity to put the military back in their box, using the power of the powerless, the force of public opinion. She failed to seize that moment, and now it's her who's being locked up. So I don't think there are new ideas in your philosopher's sense, but I think the idea of how you do a peaceful revolution is new and one to learn from.
Absolutely. It's I can't offer too many original ideas to this, but one I've had over the years, and I still believe it's worth considering, is that only failed revolutions are successful revolutions. That a revolution has to fail to an extent to preserve its accomplishments, its achievements. That it's the ideal of going for the perfect victory and the perfect revolution that destroys practically every past revolution in history.
You know, George Orwell said all revolutions are failures, but they're not all the same failure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So there are some remaining questions, but we will have to be very, very short. You understand? Yeah? Okay, please.
Sorry. Okay, so I wanted to come back to Anne's speech about this culture aspects, and I wanted to ask, because very often we discuss in the context of Europe. It's very Europe-centric discussion, in fact. So how do you think, in context of your opinion, how should we teach people who are very conservative, who base on tribes and very group culture, democracy and liberalism, if it means individualism, what is something very strange and not natural for them?
Okay, and we will have the second question at the same time.
This discussion about liberalism and basically the self-critique of liberalism is staying very much within liberalism, unfortunately, and not understanding that liberalism is already fully in crisis, and trying to solve liberalism through liberalism is missing the point that it's broken, right? And as you very well pointed out in 2008, the economic crisis, that was the Lisbon earthquake, and that gave the opportunity for the disruptors, the doubters, the enemies of the liberal capitalist structure. It gave them the opportunity to disassemble and to challenge. And these are real people with real political forces and real interests. They're not just, a shadow of the flaws of liberalism. These are people with their own interests. And these are the people who went farther than just saying it's a question of the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots are annoyed. These are people who use the have-nots to be able to rekindle racism and nationalism. These are the disruptors that are now have become the illiberals and are growing in strength. These are the people who are trying to reemerge the Russian Empire. I haven't heard any of that tonight. I haven't heard about this actual threat of the other side that is actively challenging liberalism.
So now there's your chance for the famous last words.
Okay, maybe I can start by the last question, saying that I would dare to say that the reason why you haven't heard about these people is that, in my opinion, in political sociology so far, this is the majority of the discussion. And it's an important discussion about the strategies, but here we are again in a logic of who's going to go where and who's going to fight against whom. But politics is not only about that. Politics is also about changing individual behavior, changing social political context, as for example digitalization, and understanding why people are believing these people. And I guess that if I may sort of summarize as a mediating narrative of the three of us, it's been partly this way of wanting to understand why people change their minds and what are the conditions under which they change their minds that might lead to social movements or revolutions, for example. So the citizen perspective, I think, is not something which gives, I think it's something important, and I think also it's not something which is usually done so much. And I'd like to link it with the first question, which is like, how do we actually, I hear your question as something like asking how can we merge or how can we mediate and navigate between culture and democracy and liberalism eventually. And I might keep it short and to focus on democracy, because I think the question in liberal democracy, it's not so much about all of us being liberal, but all of us living in a democratic society. And of course, there have been discussions about culture-sensitive approaches to participation. There have been a lot of studies. For example, one of the studies is in Kerala communities and showing that actually some communities are using different participatory techniques. They're not praising the individual side, but they want to listen to someone. And this is the flexibility we need to bring in the relationship between the individual and the public institution. Because not only some cultures have a sort of different communications, but also us, Europeans, sometimes we have situations in which we do not know how to handle the situation, in which it's actually highly demanding to be all the time in control of myself and to be all the time have the opinion of something. It's sometimes fine when someone tells you just do this and that. And I guess that this is something which I was trying to make as an argument. And if you would like to further that argument towards Global South and other extra-European areas, you could look towards things like participatory governance and participation studies that look exactly at that. How do we actually couple democratic institutions and culture-sensitive practices of everyday lives of people?
Anna Durnova, Misha.
I'd say probably one of the best books I've read over the past 10 years in explaining your point is Jane Mayer's Dark Money, about how a group of extremely wealthy Americans realized in the early 1990s that demographics was against them in terms of maintaining the influence of power, essentially of white males in the United States. And so instead of doing what they'd been doing up until now, which was financing individual candidates at elections, they decided upon, and this was a conscious decision, led by the Koch brothers, to build up institutions around the United States, which were perfectly legitimate institutions, and to start to influence the way people think. And these are the people who you refer to. They are extremely intelligent, extremely strategic in their thinking, and they are extremely illiberal in their intentions. And if we as liberals, if we define ourselves as liberals, are going to prosper and to continue, we have to take the Koch brothers of this world and what their strategies are very, very seriously. And one of the things, I made it briefly in a rather inarticulate way earlier on, one of the key things was that in the 1990s, everyone thought that it was axiomatic that the internet was going to be a democratizing tool, and it was going to enable people to have different opinions and come to decisions in a more rational way. And after 2008, we saw that those people who really took advantage of the scale that the internet offers in terms of the dissemination of information were actually the Koch brothers, that section of society who have used WhatsApp and Instagram and all the other tools, Facebook, much more effectively than liberals had. So I think we need to take it really, really seriously. And one final bit about the Global South. We in Europe need to understand what the Global South thinks of us.
Yep.
At the moment, we tend to think a lot about the Global South. We don't very often ask the Global South what they think about Europe. And one of the things that Vladimir Putin has understood is that the Global South doesn't think much of Europe. Yeah. And we need to understand why that is if we're going to try and engage properly with the Global South.
Misha Glenny. And finally?
Just to pick up on what both Anna and Misha just said, we have a project at Oxford called Europe in a Changing World. We had a project for 2 years trying to find out what young Europeans think about Europe and want from the EU. And we've now reversed the gaze, and we're working with universities in China, India, Turkey, Russia, and the United States, precisely to understand how they see us. And very sobering it is too, because they don't see us how we see ourselves. And what you see is the still enormous weight on their thinking of the legacy of what is now 600 years of European colonialism and 200 years of Western supremacy. So if you ask the question, why is the world's largest democracy, India and South Africa and Brazil, essentially lining up with Russia over the war in Ukraine or remaining neutral, a significant part of the answer is its payback time for 600 years of colonialism and 200 years of Western supremacy. So we really have to understand that. In conclusion, I would say, to extend my answer to Jan's question, and to bring it back to the hope of a Europe whole and free, I think we really have the chance, for the first time in European history, of achieving a genuinely post-imperial Europe. If we help Ukraine to win the war, and then help Ukraine to win the peace, and actually deliver on this agenda of EU enlargement, then there will no longer be a Russian empire, or only in small parts in Central Asia. So for the first time in European history, you will have a Europe which neither has empires overseas, nor empires on our own continent. So in that sense, objectively, it's a post-imperial Europe, but it also needs to be subjectively a post-imperial Europe, overcoming our own self-perception as these wonderful people who ultimately know best and have the finest values and are ultimately more civilized, and really understand how the rest of the world who have suffered European colonialism see us, And I think that's a great goal for the next 33 years, a post-imperial Europe.
Yes, and it provides us with a lot of food for thought for the rest of the evening. And tomorrow, let us all find some inspiration from the anniversary and from the celebrations that will occur. In the meantime, let me thank all of you for your attention and for your questions, and let me thank Anna Durnova, Misha Glenny, and Timothy Garton Ash for their wonderful contribution.